reiterated that he's a lifelong supporter of Israel. Well, our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett has also been listening in. Let's bring her in now. Kimberly, we saw a very energetic-looking Joe Biden tonight, even more energetic perhaps than when he launched his own re-election campaign. This was perhaps one of the most critical moments of that campaign.
Yeah, and he seemed to be focused primarily on his presumptive nominee, presidential nominee and opponent in the November election. By my count, he, without naming Donald Trump, mentioned him throughout this speech at least 10 times, referring to him as my predecessor. It really was more of a campaign speech than it was a State of the Union speech. And I've been watching these for about 3 decades. It was a little unusual to see a president so obsessed with his opponent. Sorry, there was a little bit of a disturbance in Statuary Hall, but I think everything is okay. It was unusual in the fact that not only did he mention him once, but he continued to mention him throughout the speech with each sort of subsequent topic that was mentioned. For example, when he was talking about the pandemic and the economic comeback, he would say, my predecessor didn't care. And he was even heckled by that, where somebody said lies. We also heard when he was talking about accusing the Trump supporters of blocking aid to Ukraine. He was making the case for his Senate bill, which would have money for Ukraine, which would have money for Israel's war on Gaza, which would have money for Taiwan. But again, referencing his predecessor. We had the president accusing his predecessor of burying the truth on January 6th, of not standing up to China, of overturning a woman's right to choose. It was throughout his speech, as he was making the case that he should have another term, he continually referenced his predecessor. So it was very unusual in that regard. One other point that we should make again is that Joe Biden has the challenge that he is the oldest president, historically speaking. But again, even as he made the case that he was fit for office, he had to talk about his predecessor. And so, once again, it was unusual by those standards. You did mention, though, that there was the major announcement about the pier that was being constructed with regard to the humanitarian aid and the need for that in Gaza. This is significant given the fact that there will be this construction of a pier off the Gaza coast. The problem for Joe Biden in all of this is that he has said the U.S. military will construct this. And he has said, and repeated this in his speech, no boots on the ground. But the fact that the U.S. military is building this is almost gaslighting, because it is impossible for the U.S. military to build this and not have boots on the ground. And that is going to open up the president to an awful lot of criticism.
Kimberly, this is obviously the issue of the war on Gaza has been a hugely divisive one for a lot of Democrats. As you say, this was more of a campaign speech than a regular State of the Union. We did, though, see lots of standing ovations. Now, despite the concerns, the very vocal concerns about Biden's age, tonight it also feels like we saw an energized, united Democratic Party behind him.
There's no question that there was a lot of energy in the room, especially around the president. And this is significant because there were a large number of Democrats that were wearing ceasefire pins. And so there was this expectation that there may be a significant portion of the president's own party that may not embrace him when he was in that chamber. But that was not the case. We saw repeated standing ovations for the president, cheering as he was talking about his policies. One thing we should note, though, as we talk about this concern about the president's policies with regard to supporting Israel, is the fact that what was significant is, for the first time, we heard the president acknowledge the significant death toll that has taken place as a result of him supporting Israel's war in Gaza. Never before have we heard the president acknowledge the excess of 30,000 Palestinians killed as a result of Israel's war on Gaza. He also went on further to talk about the fact that there have been millions more that have been displaced, and that this, he said in his own words, is heartbreaking. This is significant, but again, it could come back to hurt the president in an election year. Having the president acknowledge this could now be the substance of campaign ads used against him.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent, who's been watching the State of the Union for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Well, let's dig into some of what we've just begun discussing with Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Marwan Bashar. He's also been listening in there from London. Marwan, I've got to ask you about this pier or this port. We knew before the speech that he was planning to announce it. Officials are saying it could take, 1 to 2 months to implement, possibly thousands of US troops involved, particularly in the construction. But presumably they still need to do it with Israel's approval. And we know how US attempts to get more aid in over the land border have gone.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, if I were you, I wouldn't focus too much on this. I think this was meant for us to discuss so we can forget about all the other things that are taking place now as we speak, and the next several weeks as we live through more of the same death and destruction in Gaza that Israel continues to wage against the people in Gaza, as the genocide continues to unravel in plain sight on TV cameras. We are meant to be side by, looking on towards some American promise of something that America is want to step in and to help out while it's providing Israel with bombs. So I think a statement like that in the State of the Union address is more theatrical and more public relations and more redirecting, I should say, than it is a sincere attempt at bringing an end to the suffering in Gaza.
It's interesting, Marwan, because one of the things that many observers felt that he had to do tonight was to demonstrate empathy for the suffering being endured by people in Gaza at the moment. Did he do that? Did he do enough to convince uncommitted voters, especially those who identify themselves as Democrats but have a deep moral objection to his administration's stance on Gaza?
No, he didn't. He only used a couple of phrases that I think will prove to be important. One, on the long term, his emphasis on the two-state solution, that it is important and all the rest of it. But he's, of course, been saying that for a while now. The other bit that I thought was interesting, and I think what is important and that would be taken up in the next few days, is the idea that the Israeli government should not be taking the humanitarian aid, should not be using the humanitarian aid as a bargaining chip. I think that's important because what that is basically is state terror on the part of Israel, basically starving the people in Gaza in order to bargain along with Hamas about the future or about Hamas's position and so on and so forth. So I think that bit, I thought that was important. But in terms of the domestic politics and how much they would respond to Biden's, disheartened position on Gaza, I don't think that will go far at all. But on the other hand, if you notice, Nastasia, is that he did emphasize all the issues that are important for sort of liberals and progressives and young and women and African Americans. I think he kind of, he was quite combative, quite argumentative, and quite direct on underlining all these issues that are important for a lot of the people who would be taking up the issue of Gaza with him. So I think now the voters will be putting things on the scale, and clearly, unlike Trump, who he condemned several times on several issues regarding several important, indispensable matters to progressives and liberals and and leftists and young and people and women and so on and so forth, that I think that kind of tone of voice and that kind of, even screaming will probably resonate. And I think you're going to see tomorrow a certain rebound by Biden's popularity in the polls. And you will see already that the Republicans were going to start calling him, angry and going crazy and all that kind of thing, because he has been quite combative. And at the same time, just to add, that towards the end, he owned, his old age, as it were, making it more advantageous to his presidency in terms of experience and maturity, as it were.
Marwan, I want to dig into some of what you've just mentioned there in just a moment, but I also want to ask you about something that I noticed during the Gaza portion of his speech. So we saw, obviously, the people standing behind him, or sitting behind him. Kamala Harris, the vice president, she stood up to applaud during that portion of the speech, especially that part about the two-state solution the day after. But notably, the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, did not. My understanding is that there was bipartisan support for a two-state solution. Is that changing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, Johnson is a Christian Zionist, for God's sake. I mean, well, not for God's sake, but he's a Christian Zionist. He definitely looks at matters as such the way Netanyahu looks at it, and worse. There are the Christian Zionists among the Republican Party who don't think in a two-state solution and do agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the idea of Israel taking full control from the river to the sea, as it were. And if you remember, Trump was also against the two-state solution. His so-called deal of the century was anything but a two-state solution. But again, just to underline that these issues are also, across the board, right? And one of the things that I found entertaining, and since we are so late at night, let me just share with you some of the kind of, because Kamala Harris was nodding, right, of course, as you would expect, in everything that Biden was saying, including whatever he said on Gaza, Palestine, and so on. And mostly Johnson was, shaking his head on most issues. And while Kamala was jumping in clapping and cheering Biden, Johnson was fidgeting in his seat. And you could see that throughout the whole of Congress, where the Republicans are fidgeting, they are, all this body language not being satisfied, and the Democrats being fully behind Biden. And you would see that also on the question of Gaza, you see that question of Palestine, you see that very much on the question of Ukraine. I was kind of surprised, I'm not sure how our viewers around the world will see it, but I was surprised that he started with Ukraine, being so combative, so aggressive on the question of how Trump has failed on that question. He's on the side of Putin, as it were. And while Biden not only stands for Ukraine, but stands for democracy against autocracy and so on and so forth. Again, even on that portion of the street that you would expect Republicans, Reagan Republicans and Bush Republicans and conservative Republicans and other Republicans would be cheering for that kind of language. But I think a good portion of the Republicans, were fidgeting in their seats, even on such questions.
Marwan, right now, Biden has, by my understanding, the worst approval rating of any modern-day president at this stage in the election cycle. You mentioned a number of issues that he's trying to appeal to younger progressives on. And there obviously have been a huge number of contentious issues for some time, the border also being one of them. We saw that tonight. Did he change minds on any particular issue that stood out to you?
Look, I mean, when you go down the list, and that was a kind of relatively long speech, and the way he punched the lines on a number of things, including, say, the medical care, the pharma and the capping on the prescription drugs, about fair taxes and why billionaires are not paying their fair share, about even credit cards, about mortgages, all these things that influence everyday Americans. especially the middle class, right? And so as an administration that wants to stand for the middle class and be in the middle of the road, once upon a time, a few years ago, they said we will have a foreign policy for the middle class. Well, clearly this was a speech that's saying we have a domestic policy for the middle class. We want to shape up an economy for the middle class that is, made in America, manufacturing in America, supporting American labor. And his lines about this is a country, an economy for the middle class, a middle class that made this country, the unions that made the middle class in this country. So that kind of line of thinking will be very well received by the progressives. Going down the line, one item after another that is quite effective and quite influences everyday's Americans about their daily living, which really they want to know more about that than about, say, what happens in faraway country or in faraway continent. And I think on that, he was pretty solid.
Marwan Bashara, the Al Jazeera senior political analyst, keeping an eye on that speech for us from London. Thank you, Marwan. Well, let's now bring in Asma Mohammed. She's the lead organizer for Vote Uncommitted Minnesota. She joins us now from Minneapolis. Asma, let me start by asking you that last question I asked Marwan. What did you make of the speech? Did it change your mind?
Absolutely not. I think that myself and other organizers were disappointed to hear what the president had to say about Gaza. We heard a lot of flowery language around his empathy, his lack of empathy for Palestinians. This might be the first time that he has even mentioned the massacre of Palestinians and the starvation of millions and the displacement of millions. But he started with October 7th as if this was where it had started. And that's not the case. So I think that he further alienated voters who already were feeling like the president hasn't been listening.
Asma, can I ask you a little bit about your own personal story? Why are you uncommitted? Was there a moment or a particular point in time that pushed you over the edge?
I'm uncommitted because I care about Palestinian life. October 7th wasn't the start of when I started caring about Palestine, but I have friends in Gaza that I will never hear from again. I have a friend in Gaza who has been displaced to Rafah, and now he's heading back to Gaza because he can no longer afford to live in Rafah. He has lost dozens of pounds since I last saw him. And
Asma, what did you make of the announcement around this pier and this intention to try to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza?
Sorry, I couldn't get you.
I'm sorry, I know we're having some audio issues. Asma, I was just curious about your reaction to President Biden's announcement of this plan to construct a pier in the Mediterranean to get more aid in.
I think that can be a start, but there are trucks waiting right now. And President Biden could make a call to Netanyahu to let those trucks in. And I'm wondering why that isn't an option. Why aren't those trucks being let in? There have been dozens waiting. Why not let the aid into Rafah? And why are we allowing Israel to carry a ground operation out in Rafah? That
Asma,
would be my question.
I have to ask you, I know that there are a lot of people who feel the same way as you, and I'm trying to get an understanding of if in the election, if nothing changes, how would you vote? Knowing that if you don't vote for Biden, you could end up with a Trump White House, how do you choose to mark your ballot?
I think right now, the ball is in Joe Biden's court. I am a lifelong Democrat, and listening to that speech made me angry because I know that he can do better. And instead of courting the Democrats that are his base, we had 45,000 voters in Minnesota tell him no more genocide, ceasefire now, 100,000 in Michigan. We had 29% of voters in Hawaii. He didn't listen to us. He decided to court Nikki Haley's voters instead. So to him, I would ask why haven't you changed course? And if he still hasn't changed course by then he is at risk of losing the presidency.
Asma Mohammed, there, a lead organizer for Vote Uncommitted Minnesota. Thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera. Well, let's take you to another live event happening right now. We are hearing from the Republicans. It is Senator Katie Britt of Alabama. She's delivering the Republican response to the President's State of the Union. Let's listen in.
You know, this is where our family has tough conversations. It's where we make hard decisions. It's where we share the good, the bad, and the ugly of our days. It's where we laugh together, and it's where we hold each other's hands and pray for God's guidance. And many nights, to be honest, it's where Wesley and I worry. I know we're not alone. And so tonight, the American family needs to have a tough conversation, because the truth is, we're all worried about the future of our nation. The country we know and love seems to be slipping away, and it feels like the next generation will have fewer opportunities and less freedoms than we did. I worry my own children may not even get a shot at living their American dreams. My American dream allowed me, the daughter of two small business owners from rural Enterprise, Alabama, to be elected to the United States Senate at the age of 40. Growing up, sweeping the floor at my dad's hardware store and cleaning the bathroom at my mom's dance studio, I never could have imagined what my story would entail. To think about what the American dream can do across just one generation, in just one lifetime, it's truly breathtaking. But right now, the American dream has turned into a nightmare for so many families. The true, unvarnished state of our union begins and ends with this. Our families are hurting. Our country can do better. And you don't have to look any further than the crisis at our southern border to see it. President Biden inherited the most secure border of all time. But minutes after taking office, he suspended all deportations, he halted construction of the border wall, and he announced a plan to give amnesty to millions. We know that President Biden didn't just create this border crisis, he invited it with 94 executive actions in his first 100 days. When I took office, I took a different approach. I traveled to the Del Rio sector of Texas. That's where I spoke to a woman who shared her story with me. She had been sex trafficked by the cartels starting at the age of 12. She told me not just that she was raped every day, but how many times a day she was raped. The cartels put her on a mattress in a shoebox of a room, and they sent men through that door over and over again for hours and hours on end. We wouldn't be okay with this happening in a third world country. This is the United States of America, and it is past time, in my opinion, that we start acting like it. President Biden's border policies are a disgrace. This crisis is despicable. And the truth is, it is almost entirely preventable. From fentanyl poisonings to horrific murders, there are empty chairs tonight at kitchen tables just like this one because of President Biden's senseless border policies. Just think about Laken Riley. In my neighboring state of Georgia, this beautiful 22-year-old nursing student went out on a jog one morning, but she never got the opportunity to return home. She was brutally murdered by one of the millions of illegal border crossers President Biden chose to release into our homeland. Y'all, as a mom, I can't quit thinking about this. I mean, this could have been my daughter. This could have been yours. And tonight, President Biden finally said her name. But he refused to take responsibility for his own actions. Mr. President, enough is enough. Innocent Americans are dying, and you only have yourself to blame. Fulfill your oath of office, reverse your policies, end this crisis, and stop the suffering. Sadly, we know that President Biden's failures don't stop there. His reckless spending dug our economy into a hole and sent the cost of living through the roof. We have the worst inflation in 40 years and the highest credit card debt in our nation's history. Let that sink in. Hardworking families are struggling to make ends meet today. And with soaring mortgage rates and sky-high childcare costs, they're also struggling to how to plan for tomorrow. The American people are scraping by while President Biden proudly proclaims that Bidenomics is working. Goodness, y'all, bless his heart, we know better. I'll never forget stopping at a gas station in Chilton County one evening. The gentleman working the counter told me that after retiring, he had to pick up a job in his 70s so that he didn't have to choose between going hungry or going without his medication. He said, I did everything right. I did everything I was told to do. I worked hard, I saved, I was responsible. He's not alone. I hear similar concerns from fellow parents, whether I am walking with my friends or whether I'm at my kids' games. But let's be honest, it's been a minute since Joe Biden pumped gas, ran a carpool, or even pushed a grocery cart. Meanwhile, the rest of us see our dollar and we know it doesn't go as far. We see it every day. And despite what he tells you, our communities are not safer. For years, the left has coddled criminals and defunded the police, all while letting repeat offenders walk free. The result is tragic, but foreseeable. From our small towns to America's most iconic city streets, life is getting more and more dangerous. And unfortunately, President Biden's weakness isn't just hurting families here at home. He is making us a punchline on the world stage. Look, where I'm from, your word is your bond. But for 3 years, the president has demonstrated that America's word doesn't mean what it used to. From abandoning our allies in his disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan to desperately pushing another dangerous deal with Iran. President Biden has failed. We've become a nation in retreat, and the enemies of freedom, they see an opportunity. Putin's brutal aggression in Europe has put our allies on the brink. Iran's terrorist proxies have slaughtered Israeli, Jews, and American citizens. They've targeted commercial shipping, and they've attacked our troops nearly 200 times since October, killing 3 U.S. soldiers and 2 Navy SEALs. Meanwhile, The Chinese Communist Party is undercutting America's workers. China is buying up our farmland, spying on our military installations, and spreading propaganda through the likes of TikTok. You see, the CCP knows that if it conquers the minds of our next generation, it conquers America. And what does President Biden do? Well, he bans TikTok for government employees, but creates an account for his own campaign. Y'all, you can't make this stuff up. Look, we all recall when presidents faced national security threats with strength and resolve. That seems like ancient history. Right now, our commander-in-chief is not in command. The free world deserves better than a dithering and diminished leader. America deserves leaders who recognize that secure borders, stable prices, safe streets, and a strong defense are actually the cornerstones of a great nation. Just ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 3 years ago? There's no doubt we're at a crossroads, and it doesn't have to be this way. We all feel it. But here's the good news. We, the people, are still in the driver's seat. We get to decide whether our future will grow brighter or whether we'll settle for an America in decline. Well, I know which choice our children deserve, and I know the choice the Republican Party is fighting for. We are the party of hard-working parents and families, and we want to give you and your children the opportunities to thrive. And we want families to grow. It's why we strongly support continued nationwide access to in vitro fertilization. We want to help loving moms and dads bring precious life into this world. Wesley and I believe there is no greater blessing in life than our children. And that's why tonight, I want to make a direct appeal to the parents out there, and in particular to my fellow moms, many of whom I know will be up tossing and turning at 2 a.m., wondering how you're going to be in 3 places at once and then somehow still get dinner on the table. First of all, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. I know you're frustrated. I know you're probably disgusted by most of what you see going on in Washington, and I'll be really honest with you, you're not wrong for feeling that way. Look, I get it. The task in front of us isn't an easy one, but I can promise you one thing. It is worth it. So I am asking you, for the sake of your kids and your grandkids, get into the arena. Every generation has been called to do hard things. American greatness rests in the fact that we always answer that call. It's who we are. Never forget, we are steeped in the blood of patriots who overthrew the most powerful empire in the world. We walk in the footsteps of pioneers who tamed the wild. We now carry forward the same flame of freedom as the liberators of an oppressed Europe. We continue to draw courage from those who bent the moral arc of the universe. And when we gaze upon the heavens, never forget that our DNA contains the same ingenuity that put man on the moon. America has been tested before, and every single time we've emerged unbowed and unbroken. Our history has been written with the grit of men and women who got knocked down. But we know their stories because they did not stay down. We are here because they stood back up. So now it's our turn, our moment to stand up and prove ourselves worthy of protecting the American dream. Together, we can reawaken the heroic spirit of a great nation. Because America, we don't just have a rendezvous with destiny. We take destiny's hand and we lead it. Our future starts around kitchen tables just like this, with moms and dads just like you. And you are why I believe with every fiber of my being that despite the current state of our union, our best days are still ahead. May God bless you, and may God continue to bless these United States of America.
Well, you've been listening there to Republican Senator Katie Britt of Alabama. She was delivering the Republican response to the President's State of the Union address, as you saw there, from her kitchen table. She says the American dream has turned into a nightmare and that the American people can make a different choice. Now, amid her criticisms of Biden's policies on the border and the rising cost of living, she did mention that Republicans are in full support of the right to IVF, in vitro fertilization. That's been a huge issue in her state of Alabama after a recent court ruling on the right to life through the future of that industry and many families into chaos. Well, let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. She was also listening in from Capitol Hill. Kimberly, Senator Britt, I believe, is the youngest Republican woman to have been elected to the Senate. She is, 42? And as Speaker Mike Johnson pointed out, she's also the only current Republican mum of school-age kids serving in the Senate. This was an attempt to highlight Biden's age, right? Did it work?
Well, you know, certainly there was the attempt to try and make the case about Joe Biden and the fact that he has had what many would argue has been a border in crisis. But even as she was making that case, and it was certainly one that she tried to highlight when she brought up the case of Laken Riley, the woman who was allegedly killed by an undocumented migrant, the nursing student, that is something that actually Joe Biden was able to handle in his State of the Union speech rather well. We did see that moment where one of the members of Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was wearing a T-shirt that said, "Say her name," and handed Joe Biden a button. And that had Laken Riley's name on it. And as she heckled Joe Biden during his speech, where he was talking about his border policies, Joe Biden broke away from his speech, broke off, and ad-libbed that portion of the speech and held up the button and directly addressed this and discussed this and was not rattled by this at all, but actually said her name and confronted the issue and really threw the issue back onto Republicans, saying, look, I've tried to address this, but you've let politics get in the way. I've put forward a bill that is bipartisan in nature that would solve this problem, and you've decided you want to fight. So in many ways, the issue that the senator is bringing up is one that Joe Biden has been bringing up himself and has been able to make the case that the solution is there and politics are getting in the way. So even as this rebuttal has been taking a stab at Joe Biden, I don't know if it was successful.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Well, if you are just joining us, it's just gone past 4:15 GMT. That's after 11 o'clock at night in Washington, D.C., and let's bring you up to date. US President Joe Biden has delivered a feisty State of the Union speech to Congress. He used his annual address to lay out his policies and talk up his achievements, accusing his predecessor, without mentioning his name, Donald Trump, of jeopardizing freedom at home and abroad. He also had tough words for Israel's leaders, urging them to avoid holding up humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza for political purposes. He's also announced a plan to set up a temporary pier on the coast of Gaza to bring more supplies into the war-torn strip.
Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day. And Israel must do its part. Israel must allow more aid into Gaza to ensure humanitarian workers aren't caught in the crossfire. And they're announcing they're going to have a crossing in northern Gaza. To the leadership of Israel, I say this: humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. If the United States walks away, it will put Ukraine at risk. Europe is at risk. The free world will be at risk, emboldening others to do what they wish to do us harm. My message to President Putin, who I've known for a long time, is simple: we will not walk away. We will not bow down. I will not bow down. We must be honest. The threat to democracy must be defended. My predecessor and some of you here seek to bury the truth about January 6th. I will not do that. This is the moment to speak the truth and to bury the lies. Here's the simple truth: you can't love your country only when you win. State laws banning the freedom to choose, criminalizing doctors, forcing survivors of rape and incest to leave their states to get the treatment they need. Many of you in this chamber and my predecessor are promising to pass a national ban on reproductive freedom. My God, what freedom else would you take away? Look, it's a decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court majority wrote the following, and with all due respect, justices, women are not without electoral power. Electoral or political power. You're about to realize just how much you're right about that. I will not demonize immigrants saying they are poison in the blood of our country. I will not separate families. I will not ban people because of their faith. Unlike my predecessor, on my first day in office, I introduced a comprehensive bill to fix our immigration system. Take a look at it. It has all these and more. Secure the border. Provide a pathway to citizenship for dreamers, and so much more.
Well, as you were hearing there in his speech, Joe Biden addressed the ever-present issue of his age several times. 81-year-old Biden attempted to present his age, though, as an advantage.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation. In my career, I've been told I was too young. By the way, they can let me on the Senate elevators for votes sometimes. Not a joke. And I've been told I'm too old. The issue facing our nation isn't how old we are, it's how old are our ideas. Hate, anger, revenge, retribution are the oldest of ideas. But you can't lead America with ancient ideas that only take us back.
Well, let's go back to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. She was on Capitol Hill for us this evening. Double-digit mentions of his predecessor, Kimberly, we were saying earlier, without mentioning Trump's name. This was a speech about just how different they are.
There's no question that throughout this speech, the U.S. president tried to really portray himself as a direct contrast to his predecessor. This was very much a campaign speech, not a State of the Union speech. He tried to, as he has done in the past, say that he is putting democracy on the ballot in November. He tried to portray himself as the future, as one that is really portraying an opportunity for America, and that a vote for Donald Trump would be a vote to plunge America into darkness. He really was making the argument that Donald Trump is an ancient idea, and even though he is 81 and Donald Trump is 77, that he is progress. It really was remarkable to make that argument, given the fact that he is sort of the elder of the two geriatric men, one a former president, one a current president. One more thing that we should point out in all of this that I think is interesting in all of this is that there were a couple of moments that we do need to highlight, and that is the fact that when it comes to poll numbers, the two men are really neck and neck. And one thing about that is that Donald Trump really was low in popularity when he left office, and Joe Biden was very high. And the point where things changed for Joe Biden in his presidency was really the withdrawal of Afghanistan. And he's never really recovered from that. And there was a moment during the State of the Union address where Joe Biden was heckled, and it was very hard to hear. But what the man was shouting was Abbey Gate. And really what that was about was the killing of 13 service members at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan. And he was yelling at Joe Biden to remember that and remember those service members who were killed. And it's important to remember because that is really what led to kind of this real challenge for Joe Biden, in that his poll numbers now match the man he is likely to face in November. And so that's what the remainder of his term is going to be about. And that's why he mentioned Donald Trump repeatedly, well, not by name, is that he is now facing off against the former president in a rematch that really no American wants.
Kimberly Halkett there, our White House correspondent for us on Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Well, let's now bring in John Feary. He's a partner at EFB Advocacy. He's also a Republican. He joins us too from the US Capitol this evening. John, it's fairly unusual to give a State of the Union this far into an active election cycle. As Kimberly was just saying, this was a campaign speech rather than a typical State of the Union. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I would imagine Joe Biden saying this exact same speech at the Chicago convention. And he had, many moments of the speech where he's actually trying to actively rally the Democrats in the chamber to, shout in support of what he was saying, which is very unusual for a State of the Union. There's always kind of I worked in the Capitol for 15 years, and I've been to 15 of these State of the Unions. And you always would have, the different sides standing up and things like that. But that didn't happen this time. It was only the Democrats that were standing up, and the Republicans were pretty much sitting on their hands the whole time, except for the moments when Marjorie Taylor Greene and some other members would heckle the president, which I don't think really played that well for the Republicans, because it seemed to give Joe Biden a lot more energy. He was feisty. I kind of saw him as a cranky old man. But I think if you're a Democrat, you're just kind of delighted that he showed up and that he showed some energy, which probably gives him some sense that he will be able to withstand the campaign for the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Well, we saw minutes later Senator Katie Britt deliver the Republican response, looking very much the approachable mum at her kitchen table. What did you make of that? She emphasized border issues and border policy. That's obviously a hugely political issue heading into this campaign season.
Yeah, I thought Katie Britt did a very nice job of showing that contrast. I think the most important thing she did was make it clear that Republicans are in favor of IVF, which, as you said, is a big controversy right now. The Alabama Supreme Court ruled that a embryo is a human being, and she said, "Listen, we're all for IVF because we're pro-family." And then she, as you also mentioned, she talked about, which is seems to be the number one issue on most voters' minds, and that is the open border, which has really flooded into many different cities, increase in crime, and really an increase in drug use, especially fentanyl. And she's, by talking about Lincoln Riley and talking about this kind of festering problem in many big cities, she really kind of put a kind of a fine touch on that this is something that we should be worried about. And she called out the president for not doing enough to secure the border.
John Ferry there, a partner at EFB Advocacy, also a Republican. Great to get your thoughts in the aftermath of both those speeches. Thanks very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. Well, let's now bring in Arshad Hassan. He's a Democratic political strategist. He joins us now from Burlington in Vermont. Arshad, as we've been talking about huge concerns ahead of the State of the Union about Biden's age, we saw a few stumbles. Did he manage to sound sufficiently youthful? He was obviously trying to sound very energetic.
He certainly was very energetic. He was vigorous. He was vibrant. Some of the complaints I've seen from Republican pundits said that he was talking too fast and too vibrant. I think you're doing something right, I suppose, if people are going to vacillate with contradictory criticisms like this. If you look at the substance of what Biden was saying, he not only laid out a number of policy positions, but he laid out a very clear contrast. And if Biden is going to win for this general election, that is exactly what voters need to see. You've got a number of voters on the Democratic side who are going to vote for Biden no matter what. A number on the Trump side who are going to vote for Trump no matter what. The rest need to see that there's a difference between the two candidates. And that is what Biden laid out.
Well, one of the things he focused on was the economy. And I was interested to see polling ahead of this speech shows that many Americans believe that his administration has done badly, when actually the figures are quite the opposite. He was very specific about accomplishments and policies. Was that enough to explain it to the American people?
I always say that when people bust out data as a way to persuade people, it really doesn't stick. And I don't think that's the right way to go about it. One thing that I do think is important is actually something the Republicans are doing that is about to backfire on them, is to ask themselves where they were 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, the whole world, and the United States, of course, as well, was mired in a massive economic and public health crisis. So if people are really going to be thinking back where they were 4 years ago and where they are now, and who handled what crises well, then I think that's going to end up well for us. I have to say this, though, that when we are talking about polling, head-to-head pollings nearly a year before the election don't give us very much information.
Sure.
At this point, 4 years ago, Trump was beating Biden. And when the election came around, Biden won the election by over 7 million votes. People are going to go to the polls and ask themselves real questions. Now, the polls won't tell us very much about a head-to-head match.
Arshad, I have a very, very brief, almost one-word question to ask you, one-word answer I'm asking for. Did he do enough to convince undecided or uncommitted Democratic voters on Gaza?
He's on the path. He needed a reversal, and I think he started that reversal today. And I hope that reversal continues, personally.
Arshad Hassan there, a Democratic political strategist, with that analysis for us from Burlington, Vermont. Thank you so much, Arshad. Well, that is it from me, Nastasia Tay. Remember, you can always find much more on our